Welcome to today's webinar. Is that reasonable? Understand the complexities of medical bill reviews and their impacts on your injury case. This webinar is hosted by Medical and Life Care Consulting Services, case management, and nurse consulting firm headquartered in Massachusetts. We're excited you've joined us for this presentation. My name is Gigi Liggins, and I'm the moderator for today's session. This webinar is anticipated to run about 50 minutes, with an additional 10 minutes provided for questions and answers. We're excited to host today's webinar and look forward to an opportunity to partner with you. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce our speaker, April Pettengill. April has over 30 years of experience as a registered nurse. She's worked in the hospital setting in geriatrics, pediatrics, telemetry, and orthopedics. And for the last 32 years, she has been a case manager for work-related injuries and illnesses. Ms. Pettengill has extensive experience with catastrophic injuries, and in 2004, she became a certified nurse life care planner. In 2005, she expanded her areas of expertise by attaining the Medicare Set-Aside Consultant Certification and has been writing MSAs ever since. April currently works per diem for a local home health agency to keep her hands-on clinical skills active. While working in the community, she has the opportunity to work with patients over the continuum of care, including high-tech pediatric patients. April has been a member of AANLCP since 2004, actively working on the conference committee and most recently as secretary of the CNLCP certification board from 2007 to 2018. At this time, I'll pass it to April to get us started.
Thank you, Gigi. So we do have some learning objectives for today, and you can see them here on your screen. But basically, we're going to be talking about medical services and how they're billed. We're going to talk about the difference between the charged amounts and the reimbursed amounts. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to understand the process to determine if those charges are reasonable. And the other thing that we're going to talk about is how this impacts your legal case, whether it's a work-related case or whether it is something in the third-party liability arena. Why are past damages important? Obviously, they affect the total amount of money that you can recuperate from your case. So a large part of your past damages are medical charges or medical treatment. And these can be significant, especially if you have a catastrophic case. So there are ways to determine how medical bills impact the damages, but it is a multi-step process and it is very detailed, as you will see when we go through all of these slides. So first of all, we need to look at how medical bills are received. There are different bill types. One is what we call the HCFA 1500, which is the typical red and white form that you see up here in your upper right-hand corner of your screen. This contains a lot of information. It has the person's name, date of birth, their address, if the case is, or if the charge is related to work or not. It's going to have information about the procedure that was done. It's going to have the CPT codes, which is the current procedural terminology, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The charges, who the provider was, who the billing source is, and all of those kinds of things. It's important to remember that the HCFA 1500 is primarily for providers and not for facilities. The exception to this may be if you have a provider who is connected with a facility, say a physical therapist who provides their care at the facility. They may produce a HCFA 1500. The second type of bill that you are going to see is what we call the UBO4. It used to be a 92, but they changed it to a 4. Thank you, CMS. And this looks very similar to what you will see here in the upper left-hand corner or the left-hand portion of the pictures. It's usually a list of a bunch of different procedures that have done with dates of service, what that procedure was, and at the far right of the bill, you'll see what the charges are. At the bottom will be the total for those charges. The third way you're going to see bills are what we call an explanation of benefits, or an EOB. And this is what you see kind of here at the bottom of the pictures. It's not very detailed. It usually has the name of the provider, what the charge is, if there's any discounted amount, what the copay or deductible is, and what the responsibility is of the individual. These are usually received by the patient, and they don't really necessarily understand what the charges are for, other than, yeah, I saw Dr. Smith and he charged me this, or I went to the hospital for the emergency room visit and they charged me this. My insurance company paid this, and this is what I owe. This is not as helpful as the other two, just because of lack of detail. And you'll see why that's important as we go further along in the presentation today. There's a difference between itemized and summary bills. And the big difference is when you have a hospitalization and you receive a summary bill, there's going to be very little in terms of what was done. It may have the date of service and a total charge for that day. And then, for the next day, it would show the same thing. You may see room and board carved out of that. But what you're really looking for when you're looking at reasonableness of bills is the itemized bill. And sometimes you have to go back to the provider or to the facility and ask them for the itemization. There are also several types of medical providers that or medical procedures that you will get multiple bills for. These tend to be radiology, surgery, interventional pain procedures, and hospital stays. And the reason for that is because the facility is going to charge a portion of that bill, and the provider, the doctor or the nurse practitioner or the physician assistant, is going to charge separate from that. And again, there are exceptions to this. Sometimes if the provider is employed by the facility, their charges are wrapped into their daily per diem rates. So it's important to know this, because you may receive a bill and think, oh, I've already paid this, or I've already counted this in the total, but you may be looking at a facility versus the provider. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the general steps to determine the reasonableness of bills and past charges. So obviously the first thing you want to do is look at what the accepted injuries are. This is very important in the work-related arena, but it also can be important in the third-party liability. And we're going to talk about each of these steps in details. I'm just going through them very cursory, just so you kind of understand where we're going with the presentation. Second, you're going to look at the bills and to see if they are related to the accepted injuries. So obviously you don't want to be paying for something that's not related, or you don't want to include that into your damages, because then it becomes an issue when you're trying to collect for your case. Third, you're going to look at those charges and determine if the charges were appropriate for the injuries. If you have a broken leg, you don't want to pay for a shoulder surgery or something like that. You want to make sure that whatever is being charged is related to the accepted injuries. And the last step, which is the most time-consuming and has to be done the correct way for it to be considered by the courts to be acceptable, is you have to compare those charges against other resources to determine if the charges are reasonable. You can't just pull numbers out of the air and say, yeah, that looks right, or oh, that looks really high. There has to be some basis for that opinion. So first of all, to determine the accepted injuries, you're going to look at what happened in the accident. The initial medical records are going to be very important to determine that. And that's, if it's a work-related injury, that's going to be the responsibility of the adjuster to do that. When you're looking at third-party liability cases, it's also going to be important because you're going to need to know what part of the medical billing should be included in your damages. Then you're going to review the records for those injuries and what you expect for anticipated sequelae or additional treatment. So let's take, for example, if you've got somebody who has a broken leg. Now, there's a couple of different ways that a broken leg can be managed. You're going to expect that there's probably going to be an orthopedic who's going to come and look at that leg. Excuse me. Then they're going to determine, am I going to cast this? Am I going to put what we call an external fixator, which is pins that stick out of the skin? Or are we going to take this person to surgery right now and fix it? So we're going to be looking at that. Those are going to be the types of anticipated treatment that we would expect to see. We're also going to expect that there's going to be follow-up visits, there's going to be follow-up x-rays, there's going to be probably physical therapy and those kinds of things. So we're looking for that type of treatment in the rest of the bills. And again, if it's work-related, the carrier's information regarding accepted conditions is going to be key to the reviewer to be able to determine what of those bills is reasonable for past damages. The next step is to review the bills for charges related to the accepted conditions or injuries. So you start by looking at your medical records and you pair them up with the bills. So you want to make sure that if you've got a broken leg, that you've got an x-ray for that leg, and probably a bill from a provider to read that x-ray. So that we want to make sure matches up. If we get a bill that's for a shoulder x-ray, then we know that that's not related. So we would carve that charge out of the damages if it was included. Now, if it wasn't included, then that's great. Then somebody's already done that work for you. So we want to look at what we call the current procedural terminology, which is a CPT code. That is the code that tells you what was done. It may be an x-ray, or it may be physical therapy appointment. It might be a physician visit. All of these have a very specific code, and there are literally thousands of these codes in a very large book or online that tell you exactly what procedure was done. Some procedures have multiple codes, and you would expect that. So if you, again, are looking at the broken leg, if the person has to go to surgery, there may be multiple charges, multiple CPT codes related to that surgery. The other thing we want to look at to see if it is related are what we call the International Classification of Diseases, which is the ICD-10 code. And this is what it sounds like. It is the diagnoses for the injuries. Now, this can be a little tricky because with the ICD-10 codes, they are much more specific than the previous version, which is ICD-9. So the ICD-10 breaks it out by laterality, which means right and left. It may break it out into specific parts. So if the broken leg is in the femur, it's going to have a different code than if it was broken in the hip or in the lower part of the leg. And again, it's also going to designate right and left. So that's very important to make sure that those codes match up with the accepted condition. So next, we're going to review the charges to determine if they're appropriate. So again, like we've talked about, you want to look at the medical records and the charges and make sure that they are related to those conditions. We don't want to be paying for wart removal if we've got a broken leg. Once that has been determined, and this can be pretty time consuming too, as you're going through, you got to look at each of those codes and make sure that the diagnosis is right, make sure that the code is correct, and make sure it's all related. So then we move on to the most time-consuming part of the process, which is comparing the charges. So there are different types of codes that are used for charging. We've talked about CPT codes, but there's also what we call HCPCS codes, which HCPCS, which stands for, hang on a second, I gotta pull it up because it's I never could remember it. It is the, hang on. Healthcare Common Procedure Coding System. These kinds of codes you typically see with durable medical equipment, but there are also codes related to treatment, such as doctor's visits, vaccines, some kinds of interventions are also included in HCPCS codes. You typically see those types of things used with Medicare and Medicaid billing, but you may also see them listed in other instances. There are also other billing codes such as dental codes, and there's a whole set of codes related to those, and they start usually with a D, which will key you into that it's a dental code. On your facility bills, you will also see what they call a revenue code, and that is usually a 3-digit code, and that tells the reviewer what department the procedure was done in. So it could be either in radiology, or it could be in a surgical suite, or it could be rehab medicine. Those all have their own 3-digit code. So then you have to determine, or the reviewer of the medical records has to determine which resources they're going to use to compare the bill charges to a determined resource to make sure that those charges are reasonable. They're also going to determine variation, a plus or minus variation as to what is deemed acceptable. And this, again, has to be a methodology that is reliable and reproducible. And we'll talk about that a little later when we start talking about how the review has to be done such that it will be accepted in court. So there are different kinds of resources that can be used to determine whether charges are reasonable. And we're also going to talk about the court acceptability for those resources. So here we have three resources or types of resources that are available for use when reviewing charges. One is a database, another is Chargemasters, and then the third is calling providers. We're going to talk about each of these in detail so you can see what is good about these resources and what may be a challenge. So the first one we're going to talk about is calling providers. So this involves the reviewer identifying providers in the area to determine the area where the treatment occurred. Then they're going to have to call that provider and speak with an employee who is familiar with billing and with charges. So they have to be able to articulate the CPT codes or the HCPCS codes or the dental codes so that the person who's answering the phone can give them the appropriate charges. Some of the challenges with this is, can they go back and tell you, well, what did they charge for that code in the past? Because remember, we're reviewing past charges, so we have to compare past charges to past information. So how is this going to hold up in court? Many times this type of research is considered hearsay. And there's some question about reliability. You know, if you call a provider and get some information, and then Mary calls the provider, same provider, and talks to a different person, they may not get the same information, depending on the questions that they ask, or maybe they don't use the same way of expressing what they're looking for. So they get today's dollars versus, 2 years ago. So the question becomes, is it reproducible? And this becomes a big issue when you're looking at the reliability and the opinions of the person who is doing the review. It has to be reproducible. So someone else can pick up their work and they can go through the same steps and get the same answers. So this might not be the best method to determine reasonableness of past charges. Chargemasters. So the federal law now requires facilities to make their charges available to consumers, what they call price transparency. And if you ever have gone to a facility on their website and tried to access this information, sometimes it can be, first of all, very challenging to find it. And second of all, it may not be something that is user-friendly. Technically, are they meeting the law? Technically, with some research and with some, looking here and there around the website, yeah, you can find it. But is it really user-friendly? Oftentimes, these Chargemasters are downloadable. So you can go to, say, Mass General and you can find their Chargemaster and download it, and then you can look at all of the charges that they have. One of the tricky things that facilities have been doing lately is they are putting this information, this downloadable information, into a format that you have to have special software to be able to access. It's usually like in a .json file, or it's in a format that when you access it, it looks like a bunch of information in a text that somebody didn't know what they were doing. And it's very unreasonable and not helpful. Occasionally, you will have on their website access to codes or access to charges for what they call their top 100 or top 200 charges. So you go to a special part of their website and you put in, yes, I have insurance, or no, I don't. And then they ask you what you're looking for. Maybe it's radiology, maybe it's a surgery, maybe it's a doctor's visit, physical therapy, any of those kinds of things. And then they will bring you to their charge for that procedure. The challenge with that is it's only limited to their top whatever, or whatever they have chosen to put in that information. Sometimes when you pull it up, it won't give you anything if you say I don't have insurance, because when you're looking for reasonableness of the charges, you're not looking for discounted prices. You're looking for what the charge is, not the reimbursement. So if you put in, I have insurance and I have Blue Cross Blue Shield, or I have Cigna, or I have workers' comp, what you're going to see when you pull that charge up is what they would charge for that insurance company or for that type of injury. It may not really be their charge, what their gross charge is. And again, this is going to be mostly for procedures that would be done at a facility. Now, you may find blood work and x-rays and surgeries and physical therapy, that type of thing. But you're probably not going to find doctor's visits or the charges related to the provider themselves. So that's something to keep in mind. So how do Chargemasters hold up in court? As we've talked about, it is required, but there really is not any requirement to keep it current. So what you may find in that information may be 2 years old. It may be today. And you have to research somewhere in there. They should tell you when that information was updated. And that's going to be important if you're going to rely on it. But again, if we're looking for past charges, Chargemasters may not be the best way to do that, because accessing past years is going to be challenging or impossible. Unless the reviewer has downloaded previous year Chargemasters, there's probably not going to be a way for you to go back and access that information. As we talked about, sometimes they're not clear about the charges. And sometimes when you are able to get access to all of their codes, sometimes it'll show just their gross charges. Sometimes it shows you everything, what their negotiated price is for every insurance company that they accept. So it really depends on what each facility has chosen to make available for the consumer. So again, it may not be the most reliable source from a court standpoint and from a reliability standpoint for determining past medical charges. So that leaves us with databases. The word database sometimes freaks people out because they think, oh my gosh, this number that I'm looking at is for California, and I'm looking for Massachusetts, or I'm looking for New York, or I'm looking for Kansas or Illinois. Typically, what databases do is they pull together billions of data points, and they run it through their methodology for determining what a reasonable charge is. And most will apply a geographic factor to that when you access it. So the methodology, the specific methodology that they use is proprietary, but generally all of them have a statement of how they access, how they obtain their information, and how they process it, what they do to make sure that the charges are appropriate for the geographic area that you're looking for. And this methodology should be scientifically based, so that again, it's going to help you on the court side of things to determine or to make it so it is acceptable. So you can see here in the reliability in court, if there's a scientific basis for their coming up with percentiles in their databases, then that's going to help meet the Daubert or Dalbert challenge. Most databases offer you a range of numbers based upon the percentiles. So the reviewer who's looking at past can look at, well, I typically use this percentile, but I also see ones above it and ones below it, so that I can make a determination, or the reviewer can make a determination about, does this charge look like it's a reasonable charge, or is it way out, or is it way low? Those are kinds of benefits of databases. Some databases are open source, which means that you can go to them without paying a fee and access their data. Most of them, however, require a subscription or other form of payment to access their data. And this is because their data is proprietary. And so you're paying them for their expertise in compiling this information and making it so that it is evidence-based, or it is scientifically based, so it will be reliable. That also has a flip side to it, which is sometimes if the data is proprietary, it can't be shared in court without permission from the database. There are some databases that will give you permission, and there are others that will not. So again, the reviewer of the charges needs to know what they're using for this resource, and is it going to be something that can be reproduced or produced in a court situation. The great thing about this, and I didn't put it on this slide, is that this is highly reproducible. So anybody with access to these databases can put in the same information as the person who's doing the review and verify that that information is correct, or see where they got that information so that they know, yes, this is this is a reliable review. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what a bill review could potentially look like. So the top part is HCPCS codes and CPT codes, and then the bottom is physician codes. So the top one came from a hospital, and you can see that there's date of service of 1/20/2020. Sorry, I didn't mean to pick it like that, but that actually happens to be the date. And you'll see the first two are medications, and they have the HCPCS code. So that charge, and I'm assuming with this, I know I did this review, so I know that these are related, so I don't have to go through and cross anything out. So that portion of the review has already been done. So the first two are medications. I put the code in the description, the quantity that was billed, and what the charge was. And then I compared that against the three databases. I did not identify the databases on purpose because there are different ones out there, and it's up to the reviewer to determine which ones they find to be reliable. So you can see in the first line, the charge was $5.95, and all three of the databases came up with higher numbers for that. So the conclusion would be, yeah, that's a very reasonable charge, way lower than what everybody else is charging or what the national charge is for that. The second one, you can see the charge was $2.82. And boy, was there a range on that one. There was one that was below, one that was a little bit above it, and one that was way above it. But looking at that $2.82, does that make it a reasonable charge? It was my opinion that yes, it was, because they're taking away that major outlier. The other two were within a reasonable standard of deviation for that charge. And you can see that with all of those. I'm not going to go through each one of these items, except that I'm going to have you look down here at this one, 74846, which is a CT scan of a maxillofacial view without contrast. And this is what was charged, was $1,963. And then the three database charges are here. This is the facility portion of that charge. Then you'll see down here in the CPT codes under the physician portion, same code, right? Their charge was $211 to review that CT scan and read it and make a determination about the results of that. So there you'll see where you get one code, two bills. And the same thing here where you have an emergency room, physician visit. This was the charge. That's what the databases showed. Here's an example of what, remember when I talked about a little while ago about how sometimes HCPCS codes are used for doctor's visits. So this was the CPT code that was used. And that equates to this CPT code. This is the HCPCS code. This is a CPT code. So this is the equivalent of this code. And then what the charge was, and then what the databases showed. Now, all three of these databases had both the HCPCS code and the CPT code. And when I did this research, I looked at both. And I decided to use the HCPC code, but the CPT code was basically the same. There was a few cents difference, but it was very, very close. So here's another determination, like to show you side by side, where you will have the facility code and the physician code. So the top one here is the physician charges, and the bottom one is the facility charges. So just to show you how kind of Chargemasters can be good or not so good, you can see how this database had this amount for the code 72125, which was a CT scan. But database number 1 had 157. The charge master for the facility in this area had $292, but the charge was $183. So again, just to see how things kind of change. Now, I was not able to use a call in this situation because the date of service was too far back for a provider's office to be able to give me that information. So at the bottom, I was able to make a call, and luckily they had an old charge that they were able to provide me. But you know, it still was considered a reasonable amount compared to what the facility actually charged. Excuse me. So I want to talk a little bit about charged versus reimbursed. Oftentimes, the argument becomes, well, that's not what the insurance company paid, or that's not what we're going to pay for this charge. And that may be true, but there's several reasons for that to occur. Insurance companies, workers' comp fee schedules, cash prices have different numbers for reimbursement than what the charges are. And that's typically because there are contracts and negotiated prices that actually impact what is paid to the provider. Now, contracts are proprietary, so I could not call up Aetna or another company and say, hey, what is your contracted price with this provider for this code? They're not going to share that with me. What they will share with me is that, yes, they pay that provider. So that doesn't really help me. So it's not a reproducible thing to use a contracted price or a reimbursed price for reliability or to determine if a past medical charge is reasonable. You have to look at when a facility charges a dollar value for a procedure, what they're looking at is, what does it cost them to provide that care? What is their expected reimbursement on that? How many times are they going to do that procedure and not get paid, which happens? So they have to factor in all of those things to determine what is a reasonable charge for them for that service. And again, we're looking at charged amounts and not reimbursed amounts. We're looking at what is reasonable and not what is overinflated or under really too much by what you see in the resources. So again, it has to be something that is reproducible and something that is reliable. So when you're looking at these reviews for your legal case or for your damages, as I've been talking about throughout this whole thing, all reviews, all bill reviews must be reliable and reproducible. That's, if you can't meet those standards, it's not going to hold up in court. So your damage has basically fallen apart for past costs. Excuse me. The methodology for reviewing the bills needs to be acceptable and used by other people within that field of expertise. So you want to make sure that the reviewer has the appropriate education and experience to be able to review the bills and make a determination or an opinion about those charges that is defendable. Past damages do rely on your expert meeting these criteria to be able to be accepted. So you want to make sure that whoever you choose has got education, experience, and understanding of what they're looking at, and they're not just pulling information from the air and trying to make it work, or for them to look at a charge and say, wow, that looks really high, without having any basis for that opinion.
Well, thank you, April. This was a wealth of information. I'm sure our listeners have found your session valuable. As we close, I'd like to remind our listeners that our case consultations are always complimentary. So if you have a question about a case, feel free to reach out to Medical and Life Care Consulting and schedule your case consultation. To learn even more, be sure to scan the QR code, which takes you to our complete library of educational webinars and